Color correcting is probably one of my favorite parts of photography because that's, in my opinion, where most of the personal style comes out. You get to see how that person manipulates the colors and so on.
One of the biggest mistakes I see new photographers make is
What is up, my friends? It is Dan here from Instillment, and today we are going to be doing a deep dive into color grading in Adobe Lightroom. That's right, I'm going to be teaching you how to create your own style and use the tools that Adobe Lightroom gives you to create some amazing photographs. But before we hop into that, please, if you enjoy our content, consider subscribing and hitting that like button if you enjoy the video. It really does help us out. Now, without any further ado, let's hop into Adobe Lightroom. Alright, so let's hop right into Lightroom and take a look at the photo we're editing. So, I've already gone ahead and chosen the photo I want to edit. It's of our good friend Morgan. And yeah, so I'm just going to go ahead and make you familiar with all of your tools that you have at your disposal for color grading in Lightroom. Color correcting is probably one of my favorite parts of photography because that's, in my opinion, where most of the personal style comes out. You get to see how that person manipulates the colors and so on. So, and this is where I also, in this first tab here, I want to emphasize the importance of shooting raw. Because if you shoot raw, and let's say your photo is really underexposed, you have the ability to pull back a lot of the detail you may have lost. Versus a JPEG, you're much more limited. Like, you can still fine tune, but not to the extent you can with raw. I like to start with my exposure and tone curve. Now, tone curve can be a little daunting, but it is something that really changes the effect of the photo. So I actually like to start with the tone curve. So we're going to go ahead with that. The best way to describe the tone curve is that it controls each value of the photo, so being highlights, midtones, shadows. So what you're going to do when you're using a tone curve is you're actually selecting different points and then moving them, controlling each aspect of the photo. So where I actually like to start is I will create 3 points. I like to create one at the shadows, one in the mids, and one in the highlights. Okay, and what I like to do is I like to pull up the shadows just a little bit so you can see it kind of gives a little bit of a faded effect in the dark areas, but then pull it back in the shadows just a little bit. Okay, and then what we're gonna do is we're gonna pull up highlights, we're gonna crush the whites just a bit, and then we're gonna bring up overall middle, and that gives it a nice contrasty tone. Okay, so you can see it gives it quite a heavy contrast, but then that's where coming up into our fine tuning of our exposure is going to help fix that. So then we're just going to go through and fine tune just every single little detail to make it that look that I want. Now, this is by no means a, copy and paste. Every single photo and lighting and exposure is going to be different, so you have to adjust based on your settings and your photo that you shot. But I just want to give you an idea of what each of these kind of settings does and how it affects the photo in the long run. Presence. The presence tab is where I want to draw your attention to, because one of the biggest mistakes I see new photographers make is play with clarity. And I was guilty of this when I first started out, but everybody's first instinct when they discover the clarity tool is to blast it to the next dimension, and that looks really bad. Clarity is a very good tool, and I think the reason why new photographers like to play with clarity is because it simulates the effect of sharpness, and I was guilty of that, and I learned very quickly from people who had a lot more experience than me that that is not a good way to simulate sharpness. In fact, as you get more experience, or at least from my experience, I've brought clarity down, especially when working with portraits. Portraits, you want to soften the face, and what clarity does is it brings more attention to unwanted contour on the face. So I like to bring that down, and we want to make it look more soft. So I don't really tend to go more than +20 or -20 on each end of clarity. So I like to go -10, I find is the sweet spot. See, it's just a nice, soft, flattering look on the face. Okay, so as for exposure, I'm happy with this. This is kind of the style I like to have in the photo. As you can see, the tone curve made a huge difference. You can see it before and after. Already, right off the bat, photo looks a lot better. So now this is, in my opinion, in the HSL tab, this is where the style comes out. And so essentially you have 3 sections. You have your hue, saturation, luminance. And what hue is essentially the timbre of the color. So each individual color, you can change the tonality of it to be a little bit more towards one color temperature. Then in saturation, saturation is the vibrance, how vibrant each individual color is. So if I pull down the greens, then the greens are completely gone, and so on. And then luminance. Luminance actually took me the longest when I was first starting out what luminance was. Luminance is the brightness of each individual color. So we'll use greens again because they're the brightest, or they stand up the most. So again, you can see if I bring it all the way down, it lowers the brightness of the greens. Bring it all the way up, it increases the brightness. Now, let's talk about split toning. Split toning is essentially a stylistic technique you can use. You can either affect what color directly goes into the highlights and what color directly goes into the shadows. So what I generally like to do is I like to go into the cyans over here, and I'll bring up the saturation, let's say like 7. And we can see our highlights just got a little bluer, and then I'm going to go into my shadows. I like to make it a little orangey yellow. Again, we'll go 8. And we can see what happens when I toggle that switch. This is a personal preference. In fact, I'm finding the orange is a little too much. I'm going to go down to 5. And yeah, it's very subtle, but I do like the effect it has. In fact, I might bring up the blues a little bit. No, too much. Okay, so that's split toning. Obviously, this balance will change how much it favors either shadows or highlights. So it'll either really favor the blues or the oranges in this case. I like it right in the middle. In fact, you know what? I might go like -10, a little bit more favoring the oranges. And then down here you have your effects tab. So in this case, this would be if you wanted to add any film grain or if you wanted to add any vignetting. Now again, you want to be, the lesson from this is be subtle with everything. So vignetting essentially adds the circular, vignette effect. So you can go as dramatic or you can go a negative vignette, which I don't want to do because that looks like clip art and we don't want that. Now film grain, that's pretty much simulating the effect of film grain. So again, you can blast it up to the craziness and it looks really, really grainy, which I don't necessarily want. I like it with some photos, not with others. In this case, I don't think I want to add any film grain because I really like how clean this photo looks. And finally, you have the calibration tool, which can be a little confusing at first to understand, but when you play with it, you get a better grasp of what it is. But essentially, it is referring to how every single camera brand's image sensor is calibrated slightly different. So when you hear people say that some camera brands offer better skin tones than others, they're referring to this. And so what Lightroom is letting you do with this tool is actually adjust how your image is calibrated in terms of the color values. So this is slightly different than adjusting in the HSL, because let's say if you're adjusting blues in the HSL, rather than just affecting the image that has blues in it, when you're changing the calibration, you're actually changing what the definition of blue is to the image. So I know it can be a little hard to understand, but if you just play with the dials, which I encourage you to do, you can actually get a grasp of what it is actually changing in the image. Alright, and then the last thing I like to do after I've gone ahead and got the photo to that place that I'm happy with, then I actually like to go back and look at my white balance here. And that's it. I hope you got an idea of what it's like to color grade in Adobe Lightroom. As you can see, the before and after, it's very significantly different. And I'm not quite done with this photo. There's a few more adjustments I want to make, but in this video, I just wanted to demonstrate the tools that you can use in Adobe Lightroom to be able to play with the color and color grade. And that is all, folks. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I really hope you learned something about editing in Adobe Lightroom. It is a really awesome software that can give you some great results if used correctly, of course. Now, take this video with a grain of salt. This was more of a guideline of how to use the tools that Lightroom gives you. It's by no means here's a how-to of exactly how to edit each photograph, because let's face it, everybody has a different style. So on that note, we're going to end off today's video. If you have any questions, please feel free to let us know in the comments and we'd be happy to get back to you. Until next time, this has been Dan on another episode of Instillment HQ. We will see you guys later.